Alrighty, welcome in everyone to just another edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, September 10th, and we are getting really close to an incredible Week 3, a ton of big-time games that we got to break down on today's show. We will get into a full reaction show on Friday, but want to make sure I get these picks out there as quickly as possible, and we'll start with the quote-unquote big games. Now, we will get into Georgia, Tennessee in the second segment because we got a couple of SEC games we got to break down. We have LSU, Florida this weekend, Arkansas, Ole Miss, Vanderbilt goes up to South Carolina, a couple of huge ones that we'll talk about in the second segment. Then we got a little bit of a whip around, a number of games to watch this upcoming weekend. Darien Mensa returns down to Tulane for a massive matchup for the Green Wave that could put them firmly at the top of the CFP conversation, right up there with South Florida. Then we got some superlatives at the end of the show. One game that I'm watching that might be a little bit more chaotic. We'll talk about that at the very end. But let's go ahead and jump into this. Let's get into these big games. I got three games that really stood out to me outside of the Georgia-Tennessee game. We will get to that here in a second. But we'll start with the one that I cannot wait for, maybe as much as just about any game this upcoming weekend. Clemson goes on the road to Atlanta. They face off against Georgia Tech after a very tough game against Troy. Georgia Tech is 2-0 at this point and won a game on the road at Colorado in a very weird circumstance in week 1, then played Gardner-Webb last week, went about their business, handle it, and now they invite Clemson into town. This is a massive game. In terms of the games this weekend, I think this might have as much to do with the CFP race as just about any of them, because if Clemson loses this game, they're 1-2 with a loss already in conference. They're behind the 8 ball in a lot of different ways, and frankly, in a conference that I think is going to be so hotly contested, I'm not sure if you can be behind the 8 ball in the first game and find your way back into it. For Georgia Tech, they win this one. There's an opening here. There's a lot of games that they should be and will be favored in if they win this one. And then you got Georgia at the end of the year. That's probably the only game, if they were to win this one, that they would not be favored in. So everything's on the table for the Yellow Jackets in this game. If they find a way to win this one, they are firmly on their way to competing for the ACC and maybe finding a way into the CFP depending on how the rest of the season goes. The matchup to watch in this one is the Georgia Tech run game against the Clemson linebackers. Frankly, that's probably the matchup to watch in just about every Georgia Tech game going forward because run fits against this team are incredibly important. There's just about every team in the country struggles against this run game because it's so good at misdirection. Buster Faulkner's so good at changing people's eyes and manipulating what they want to do that they were able to run the ball on a really elite Georgia linebacking group and Georgia front seven really last year. They can do that against this Clemson group. Now, this Clemson group is loaded. You have Sammy Brown at linebacker. You have Wade Woodaz. You have really, really good players, even on that front seven. You got Peter Woods. You got TJ Parker. You have freaks. There's no doubt about that. From an athleticism perspective, you're about as well equipped to handle this Georgia Tech run game as just about anyone in the country. The problem is it's really hard to handle even if you are the very best team in the country. There are so many different things that this team does, that Buster Faulkner does, that will mess with your eyes, and if you're not right, Haynes King is 15 yards down the field before you even know what hit you. They have to be right. They have to find a way to run fit the right way. They have to find a way to meet Haynes King in the backfield instead of 2 yards downfield, because then 4 yards really does start to pile up, especially against a team that's so efficient like Georgia Tech. So that's going to be the thing to watch. I think this Clemson front seven is going to have their work cut out for them. They got to be right. They got to make sure they don't overcommit to runs. They don't overcommit to a certain hole because it's going to be really hard to catch up with Haynes King and Jamal Haynes as they break down the sideline when you don't know where they are. For keys to the game, the Georgia Tech quarterback situation is something that not a ton of people are talking about going into this game, but Aaron Philo played the entirety of the Gardner-Webb game. Haynes King did not get a snap. And if you watch the Week 1 game against Colorado, you probably know why that is. He looked gimpy towards the end of that game, and frankly, he kind of does towards the end of just about every game that he plays. That's the way that Haynes King plays football. I think everyone's kind of fallen in love with that. But it is kind of a weird card that Buster Faulkner can play in this game. You have Haynes King, the elite runner, the elite processor of the offense, the guy that can execute everything right in front of them. Aaron Philo is a better passer of the football. He's a more gifted passer of the football and a guy that can really make things really interesting against a Clemson secondary that got beat a couple of times against Troy last week. If you can find a way to work in these both these quarterbacks, you can keep a defense that is very aggressive, that's very front foot. You can keep them on their heels, and that's totally a different ballgame for Georgia Tech. Now, we'll see how that works out. It looks like Haynes King is healthy. Looks like he will get the start. Will we see Aaron Philo in this game, and what are the circumstances? Is it Haynes King is totally healthy and he just leaves the game for a couple of plays, or is it Haynes King is a little bit gimpy after one quarter and Aaron Philo has to come in and try to save them? It'll be really interesting to watch that unfold. I think Haynes King is going to start the game, and usually that means he's going to end the game one way or another. We will see how all of that kind of unfolds this weekend. Clemson, is this a regroup spot? They looked terribly last week, and I think they understand that. I think this week of practice has probably been very, very intense around Clemson, but they got to play a lot cleaner because this team is going to take advantage of every mistake that you make, where Troy took advantage of a couple, didn't quite take advantage of all of them, and had an ability to be up probably 23 or 24-0 going into halftime, left a little bit on the table. Georgia Tech's not going to do that. You have to be able to put this team away. You have to make sure you don't make the mistakes you did a week ago, and that's going to be a tough thing to do against this team. And then a game flow, I think, is really interesting in this one because Georgia Tech, if they find a way to lead this one early, it's going to be really hard for Clemson to keep up. It's going to be really hard for them to stop the run game, and frankly, I think Clemson could start to panic. If they go down 14-0, 10-0 in this game, they're probably looking up at that scoreboard and getting very nervous, maybe starting to force the ball, and then you have one mistake that could totally kill you. On the Georgia Tech side, if they get down in this game, if they get an uncomfortable spot, maybe Clemson comes out with their hair on fire and goes up by 14. Then you have a Georgia Tech team that really does struggle to get back into games throwing the football. So it could get ugly that direction if Clemson's able to jump out to an early lead. Frankly, I think this one's going to be weird. I think it's going to be down to the wire. I think it's going to be really intense. I am going to pick Clemson to win this one, 27-24. I think it's going to be really close. I don't think Clemson's going to look fantastic. I think people are going to walk out a little bit confused about what Clemson is moving forward. I think they're going to find a way to win. I think Dabo Swinney's going to find a way to get this team ready, and they're going to be able to go into Atlanta and get a massive win. Can't promise it's going to look pretty, but frankly, against Georgia Tech, you're probably never going to look as pretty as you will eventually. The next one we have is South Florida going up to Miami. This one's fun. There's no two ways about that. South Florida's kind of taken the world by storm, has gotten a lot of attention recently after their win over Florida. This is going to be a tougher game. I can promise you that. This is going to be a very much of a battle, and one that South Florida kind of wants to do sort of the exact same thing they did against Florida, but the big thing here is you're going to have to find a way to turn in more than 18 points. Miami's not going to give you the offensive performance that Florida did. They're probably not going to give you the play calling performance that Florida did, with all due respect to Billy Napier. But the reality is South Florida is probably going to have to play a little bit cleaner in this game, probably going to have to play a little bit more explosively on offense, and do a number of the things that they are more than capable of doing. Probably just going to have to do them a little bit more consistently in this game. For the matchup to watch, I'm going Byron Brown versus this Miami front seven. This is as athletic of a front seven as they will face the entirety of the year. Now, Florida comes very, very close to this Miami group, but when you have Ruben Bain, Akeem Mesidor, and a couple of those ridiculous defensive tackles that Miami has, that run game is going to be really interesting for South Florida. What they want to do is kind of take the air out of the ball, limit possessions, make sure it's really, really tough for that offense to get going on the other side, and then hit a couple of big plays. And a lot of that comes with Byron Brown's legs, very athletic individual, one of those guys that can keep you in ball games really late against these more physical teams because there's very few guys on the football field that are more physical than Byron Brown. So this is going to be a huge matchup. They're going to have to find running lanes for this guy because if you can't, then the passing lanes get a little bit more tight, and Byron Brown makes a mistake that he hasn't made thus far throughout the year. He is going to make one of those mistakes if you find a way to slow the run game. If they don't, then this game can get really interesting in a hurry. As for keys to the game, I think the number of possessions is fascinating in this one. USF wants to slow the game down. They want to take the air out of the ball. They want to run the ball very efficiently and then hit a couple of big plays down the field. That's the way they operate on offense. That's the way Alex Golesh has kind of always operated on offense. If they can find a way to slow down this game, they only gave Florida they only gave Florida 4 possessions in the first half of that Florida game. They were only able to stack up 9 points. They were not able to pull away from USF. They got 9-6 at halftime, and that gave South Florida the opening that they needed in the second half. If Miami doesn't come out strong in this one, South Florida is going to have a lot of confidence going into halftime, and then things get a little bit sketchy with 1 or 2 plays in the second half like it did against Florida. Miami's got to be able to stretch this thing out early, get a number of possessions on the board, get the ball in Carson Beck's hands consistently. If they don't, this one could be 9-6 going into the second half like Florida was, and then everything is on the table for South Florida. Getting after Carson Beck is going to be huge. He has been much better against the pressure early on in this year than he was last year. Doesn't mean you can't still get after him and force a couple of mistakes. He is a guy that wants to make a play. He is a guy that is more than confident in this offense, it seems, but is still relatively new, still wants to push the ball to these wide receivers, and maybe if you can get a couple of those athletic linebackers you have, like Jalen Schuler, in his face, then you might have a problem if you're Carson Beck. And then one mistake, like we were talking about, can totally change this football game. It is one of those things that when you're facing Miami, they're going to run an efficient offense. That's the way they operate. There's very little chance that you're going to get Shannon Dawson and this team to overextend. The one way you can do that is heat up Carson Beck and make him a little bit nervous. Maybe he sails one ball and you're running it the other direction for 6 points. That could totally change this football game. You have to find a way to get after Carson Beck while still holding integrity on the back end. Very tough thing to do against these Miami receivers, but you got to find a way to do it. And then, maybe not a key to the game, but USF has a little bit of magic here. It is a very, very interesting team, a team that didn't play their best football a week ago and found a way to win on the road at the Swamp. I don't know. They feel a little bit special, and frankly, to be totally honest, the last time they were ranked 18th in the country, they went on to beat the number 5 team in the country on the road against West Virginia back in 2007. Not saying it's going to happen this time around, just something to watch as we get a little bit closer to this weekend. Maybe number 18 is the magic number for USF throughout this season and throughout their history. But I am going to pick Miami. I'm going to pick Miami to win this one 31-20. I think the offense is just a little bit too much. I think the athleticism on the outside is going to give them a little bit of a fit early on in this game, and they're able to make it look a little bit better towards the end, but I think Miami's able to win this one. South Florida still firmly in the mix and probably at the top of the G5 standings for the CFP, but still with a little bit of work to do going forward. Then we got this one. Texas A&M goes up to South Bend to face off against Notre Dame. Really weird one here because Notre Dame goes on the road in week 1, loses to Miami in kind of heartbreaking fashion in some respects, and then they move forward and they get a bye week. Very, very weird bye week in week 2. Now they get Texas A&M coming to town. It's going to be a really weird game. We don't know too much about CJ Carr. Looked really strong in his first game against Miami. This is going to be a little bit tougher of a battle, especially on the back end with some of those DBs that they have. It's an elite group for A&M in a lot of different ways. They're going to have to play really, really good football. There's a number of things for Notre Dame they're going to have to figure out. I think the biggest one of the bunch is that run game and that offensive line. The offensive line against A&M's pass rush and A&M's defensive line in general is going to be really tough. And I think you have a good group over there at Notre Dame. You do have a relatively young group overall, and it's a really good group on the other side. Cassius Howell had back-to-back sacks this past weekend. It is a very, very tough group on the other side for A&M. And frankly, you got a kid in CJ Carr that's going to have to make plays in this game. A&M's run defense is too good for them to be able to lean on the run the way they ultimately probably want to in this year. Now, the Miami game was a little bit different, but at the end of the day, you're going to have to put the ball in CJ Carr's hands throughout this game. Is he going to have time to make the plays? Is the big time question here. Will these wide receivers have the openings to make the plays that they need? It'll be really interesting to watch this battle all game, and frankly could be the deciding factor in CJ Carr having an incredible game and taking off in the national conversation, or kind of shrinking from the moment. They go 0-2 and are pretty much out of the CFP conversation. The keys to the game, the explosive passing game is going to be really interesting to me. Both these teams want to lean on the football. They want to run the ball. They want to be able to win a game, 24-20 and kind of roll on about their business. These wide receivers are pretty special on both sides. I do think Casey Concepcion is about as good as you're going to find after the catch in the entire country. Mario Cristobal not too far behind him. And then on the other side, Jordan Faison plays really good football. We haven't seen Jaden Greathouse too much throughout this year. I think he's going to be a big-time player for this football team. Then you got Malachi Fields. You have a number of players that are going to make plays for you. Now, do I think there's going to be 5 50-yard touchdowns in this game? Probably not. I don't think these teams are going to be airing the ball out all game. I do think it's going to come down to 1 or 2 plays through the passing game, whether that's CJ Carr or Marcel Reed making big plays down the field. These teams are going to run the football. They're going to come down to probably the fourth quarter in this football game. Maybe it's one big throw by one of these quarterbacks that makes the difference. The run game margin is really interesting for a number of reasons. Both these teams, in my mind, are top 20, top 10 rushing offenses in the entire country. They're not using Jeremiah Love very much over there at Notre Dame, at least through one game. We will see how that develops this upcoming weekend. But Jeremiah Love, Jadarian Price, they got to be a bigger part of the offense. They have to be the guys that you lean on very aggressively in this offense, especially with a young quarterback. I tend to believe they're going to do that a little bit more in this game while still hopefully keeping the option open for a big play downfield. And then on the other side, Le'Veon Moss, Ruben Owens, elite duo as well. And I think it's a team that obviously has a little bit more of that quarterback run game involved in it. Maybe we see Kenny Minchie in this game for Notre Dame, but it is going to be a back and forth matchup. When it comes down to two teams that really love to run the football, who can get a little bit of a margin there? It might not be great, it might not be massive, but 50 yards, one way or the other, could very well decide this game, especially if you're able to do it a little bit more consistently throughout this game. It'll be really interesting to watch which one of these running backs, which one of these teams can find a way to run the ball more efficiently. And then, kind of piggybacking off of that, Marcel Reed's health coming into this game is a little bit up for debate. Now, he seems to be healthy. It seems like he could have come back last week, but they obviously didn't need him in that matchup. Now they move forward to a game that they're going to need every bit of him. There's no, taking plays out of the playbook because he's not fully healthy. There's no quarterback run game in this one because we have to keep Marcel fully healthy going forward. You're going to have to lay it all on the table. You're going to have to unlock every bit of your playbook, use every bit of every player that you have. That includes Marcel Reed's legs. What does that look like throughout this football game? Not necessarily in the first quarter. What does it look like in the third quarter? Can they still unlock those legs? Can they still use that when he's taken a couple of hits from time to time, and maybe it gets a little bit tougher to utilize that? They're probably going to still have to, in some form or fashion, either as a decoy or in real time. They're going to find a way to use Marcel Reed's legs. If they can't feel confident in that, then it becomes a little bit bigger of a question for A&M on the road. I think it's going to be a fun one. I think these two teams are really, really good. I think they have the ability to make a CFP run. I think there's one team that's a little bit more desperate, and it's the team at home. Notre Dame wins this one 24-20 in my eyes. I think it's going to be really close. I think it's going to be a tough-fought battle. I don't think it's going to be any team pulls away or any team looks overly incredible against the other team. I just think Notre Dame makes enough plays. I think Jeremiah Love makes one massive play down the football field. I think he is a very dangerous player and a guy that I can't imagine they're not going to unlock him in this football game. I can't imagine they're not going to utilize him as much as they possibly can. I think Notre Dame wins this one. I think they have a little bit of that back against the wall type of mentality in this one, knowing that if they go 0-2, they're probably digging themselves out of a hole that I don't know if you can dig yourselves out of before the end of the season. So I'm going to pick Notre Dame to win that one. I will pick Miami to beat South Florida. Kind of wish South Florida would win that one. If they do, the G5 position might be decided already. But that's totally a story for another time. And then I'll pick Clemson to beat Georgia Tech for the time being. Going to be a really fun one in there in Atlanta. And then we got probably the biggest one coming up here in a second. Georgia goes to Tennessee. And then we got a couple other SEC games to break down for you right after this, so stick with us.